talking about some of the flaws in our democratic system. We'll start off with our quote from Alexander Hamilton. He didn't really trust the common man. He said the people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. And for that reason, he pushed to set up the Electoral College system, which is a method of indirect election for the President of the United States. And there are certainly some flaws with that. We see that in the 2000 election and the 2016 election, because people who voted for the candidate who won the majority of popular votes did not win in the Electoral College. So you need 270 votes in the Electoral College. That's the majority. And if you don't get that, then the House of Representatives gets to decide. So I had asked you for some flaws of the system, and I filled this in for you because we didn't really talk about this. So the winner of the popular vote does not always win the election. That's the biggest flaw. Another major problem is that the votes of voters in low population states have a greater weight than the votes of people in high population states. And this is because the number of votes in the Electoral College that each state has is equal to the number of representatives it has in Congress. So if you take Wyoming, it has 3 electoral votes because it has 1 member of the House and 2 senators. And so it has 142,000 voters per elector, compared with New Yorkers, who have 29 electoral votes, and we have 519,000 voters per electors. So I had mentioned that you could check out this website, which I have pulled up because it's just very interesting. So let's take Wyoming here. They're ranked first. So each voter in Wyoming has a much greater say than we do as New Yorkers, and we're ranked 51st even after the District of Columbia. So you want to take a different state. North Dakota looks pretty dark here. They have 174,000 people per electoral vote, 4th, whereas California has 508,000 people. So the people in these low populated states have more say than we do. And that seems undemocratic. But this is written into the Constitution. We can thank Alexander Hamilton for that. And the only way to change it would be, well, there are a few ways to change it. We need a constitutional amendment. And the states with the low populations would never agree to that. And remember, you need 3/4 of the states to agree to an amendment to the Constitution, so that's not going to happen. Another way to do it is have each state allocate their electors according to the popular vote instead of an all or nothing vote. Like if Hillary Clinton won New York in 2016, she got all of New York's electoral votes instead of splitting it according to the popular vote. So if each state agreed to do that, that would be a way to change it, but it's unlikely that that would happen. It could, but it's unlikely. All right, so that's one flaw. Another part of our electoral system is called a primary. And so this is like a runoff election to see who's going to win from each political party. So you have 2 different methods of primaries. It's a caucus or an actual primary. A caucus is when groups get together and they try to convince each other who to vote for, like we see in Iowa. And a primary is literally a runoff vote, a direct vote. So there are open and closed primaries. An open primary, registered voters in either party can vote in either party's primary. So if you're a registered Republican and you want to vote in the Democratic primary, you can. In a closed primary, only voters registered for the political party can vote in that party's primary. So if you're a registered Democrat, you can only vote for the Democratic nominee. You have no say in what goes on in the Republican primary. And this is how most states are. So the closed primary kind of helps aggravate political extremism because as a candidate is trying to appeal to the party's quote unquote base, the people who are likely to vote in the primary, they're going to appear very far to the left or very far to the right um, to get the nomination. And once they get the nomination, then they typically move more to the center. Okay, so that's another part of our system. Another really disastrous part of our system is something called gerrymandering. So as you may recall, there are 435 seats in the House of Representatives. And every 10 years, the government takes a census to determine how many people live in each state. And then they reallocate which state, how many seats each state gets in the House. So, for example, New York, every 10 years, we lose seats because our population goes down and compared to other states. So that's called reapportionment, when they reapportion the number of seats each state gets in the House of Representatives. And also, as you may recall, the Senate has 2 from each state, and that doesn't change. So when the seats are reapportioned, then it's up to each state to set up new district lines within their state, and that's called redistricting. And let's say you have a member of the state house, let's say in Albany, and it's controlled by Democrats, and they get to redraw the district lines. So what they might do is they might draw the lines in such a way that more Democrats get elected to the House of Representatives and fewer Republicans get elected. So if you look at what happened as a whole in the 2016 election, Republicans won 50.6% of the vote nationwide, but they got 56.8% of the seats nationwide. And that's due to gerrymandering in favor of Republicans. And recently, the Supreme Court heard a case challenging political gerrymandering, saying that it's denying people their right to vote. But the Supreme Court refused to hear the case, and the Supreme Court has generally sidestepped this issue, saying it's not really our place to get involved in what happens with state redistricting. But the way it can happen, these are other states. These are other states. This is Wisconsin, and how they kind of redistricted to give the Republicans an advantage. This is another instance in North Carolina where Republicans redistricted to give the Republicans an advantage. And it's a flaw to the system because it allows the party that controls the state government to redraw district lines so they can get more votes for their own political party in the House. This robs people of their vote. And they do this by jamming all of the Democratic voters into one district so they get one representative, or by distributing Democratic voters among Republican districts so they will be outvoted, or vice versa. And so you can look and see, the history of gerrymandering if you are interested in when you take government next year, and see, which political party is more responsible for this type of behavior. Okay, another major problem with our system is it has to do with lobbying campaign finance. Okay, so when candidates go off to run, they have to raise a lot of money. And in this one study that was done, it said the congressperson spent an average of 3 out of 5 weekdays raising money for their reelection. Okay, this is time not spent caring for and debating about issues that benefit the society at large. And so that's a disaster. Another problem is that when people contribute money to campaigns, they expect a favor in return. So think about that handout that I gave you guys on the Nixon administration and all of the examples of corruption in that situation. That the Nixon administration was just kind of doing business as usual for the government. Okay, that's not the way it's supposed to be. I think the Nixon administration was an extreme case because it was literally, you pay us, we'll do you a favor. I don't know if it's necessarily that blatant in all cases. And there's a Supreme Court case that you should know called Citizens United. And this was a 5-4 vote along ideological lines. The majority held that First Amendment corporate funding of independent political broadcasts in candidate elections cannot be limited. So what that means is, let's say you have a private organization who is super conservative and they really don't like Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton, and they come out and they make commercials in favor of Trump and bash Hillary Clinton or bash Joe Biden, and that's considered free speech. So it cannot be limited. And so you see groups with a tremendous amount of money influencing the outcome of the election in the name of free speech. And so when we talk about like all of the bad Supreme Court cases in history, this Citizens United is really a disaster of a case because it allowed corporations to really spend a ton of money influencing who gets elected. And then, of course, they expect favors in return. Okay, moving on to voter ID laws. Voting has been traditionally considered a right of American citizens, and you walk into, once you register to vote, you sign your name onto your voter registration form, then you go in and you just sign, and you don't have to show ID. But voter ID laws require, obviously, to show ID before you go into voting instead of just signing your name. And that might not seem like a big deal, but there are voters who do not have specific types of ID. They might not have a driver's license. They might not have anything with them. And this affects low income, racial, ethnic minorities, the elderly, and people with disabilities. Okay, so this makes it more difficult to vote. And you see this typically in Republican states where they're trying to prevent these groups from voting. And so this is obviously a problem. Supreme Court refused to hear two separate cases, one from North Carolina, one from Texas. In both cases, lower courts threw out the state's voter identification laws because they were discriminatory and targeted African Americans. Okay, so this is a problem. And this is another really famous case, a terrible case that you should be aware of, called Shelby County versus Holder. And just to give you a little background, I typed this part in, that part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 required that states with a history of discrimination get federal approval to change their voting plans prior to making any change. This is called preclearance. The Supreme Court declared this part of the Voting Rights Act unconstitutional. All right, so this is our quote from the Supreme Court website. Well, this is not the Supreme Court website, but it is a website that talks about Supreme Court cases. The court held that Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which is this preclearance section, imposes current burdens that are no longer responsive to current conditions in the voting districts in question. So basically, the Supreme Court said right here that discrimination is over. We don't have to worry about that anymore. Although the constraints this section places on specific states made sense in the 1960s and 70s, they do not any longer and now represent an unconstitutional violation of the power to regulate elections that the Constitution reserves for the states. Okay, so our question is racism over? Is discrimination over? Well, I think we can judge from the the protests against the police, that maybe we still have some lingering problems with race in our country that could affect voting rights. And when the Supreme Court made this decision, certain states in the South had new plans for voting waiting in the wings. And so as soon as this decision was made, they implemented their new voting laws, and it did affect the way people voted and their people's ability to vote. And so if you think about the current primary that was just held in Georgia, I don't know if you guys saw the lines for people waiting for blocks and blocks trying to get in to vote. And so that is clearly a problem, and it's going to be a problem in this upcoming election unless somebody, kind of takes control and does the right thing. Huh. Do we think that will happen? I don't mean to be cynical. Anyway, that's the end of our discussion, and please submit your AIM response or response to the question that I asked. I might change it up as somebody suggested. All right, have a great day, everybody.